and welcome to our program Where God Weeps, a program where we talk about the situation of the suffering church around the world. Today, more than ever, it is imperative to promote an interreligious dialogue between Christianity and Islam that facilitates a true understanding of both faiths. The combination of Christianity, Islam, and democracy have been particularly challenging in some regions in Africa. To know more about these efforts to promote this dialogue, it is my privilege to welcome Father Robert Dowd, author and expert in this topic. Father, welcome to our program.
Thank you, Jonas. It's great to be with you.
Father, you published a very important book. Just reading the title, to me it sounds quite a challenge to put in the same sentence these words, which I say, Christianity, Islam, and liberal democracy, lessons from Sub-Saharan Africa. What can we learn? What do you mean? Is this a dialogue? What is the focus of this important book?
Well, Jonas, the focus is really on one big question, and that is, how do Christian and Islamic religious communities affect the political actions and attitudes of those who belong to them? And so I really tried to understand what shapes how these religious communities affect the political actions and attitudes of the Christians and Muslims who believe in them, who belong to them. So essentially what I've found is that the extent to which a setting is religiously diverse and integrated actually has a very important impact on the effects that religious communities have on political actions and attitudes. In other words, Christian and Islamic religious communities in the most diverse and integrated settings actually are more encouraging of political actions and attitudes that are conducive to liberal democracy, civic engagement, and religious tolerance.
Now, what makes you make such a statement? What are the case studies that you're presenting in the book?
Sure. Well, we conducted a mass survey of Christians and Muslims in Nigeria, in Uganda, and in Senegal. And we found evidence that religious observance was having a much more positive impact on civic engagement and tolerance in the most diverse setting, the most diverse country, that is Nigeria, as compared to Uganda and Senegal. Senegal being predominantly Muslim and Uganda being predominantly Christian. Nigeria being a real mix of Christians and Muslims.
It's almost half and half in Nigeria,
almost half and half.
The population.
Exactly. And a lot of people look at Nigeria and they think, hey, and they hear about the interreligious violence in Nigeria and they think religious diversity must be a problem. But when you really dig down inside Nigeria, you find that the most diverse and integrated settings tend to be those that where Christians and Muslims are really getting along, and where the religious communities are encouraging tolerance, religious tolerance, and peaceful political participation. Now,
Father, to understand why you as a priest, you are involved in this topic, it's because, what is your academic background?
Yeah, so I'm a political scientist, believe it or not, and so members of my congregation, the Congregation of Holy Cross, work at colleges and universities in the United States in a special way, and I'm actually at the University of Notre Dame in Indiana. So my congregation encouraged me to pursue graduate studies and to become a faculty member, and we have a number of priests and religious who are on faculty at Notre Dame and other colleges and universities in the United States.
Father, of course, the first thing that comes to mind after the latest terrorist attacks in different parts of the world, the question is this really viable, a coexistence of these two visions of the world? Because it's not only a religion, it's really a cosmogony of a way we see the world, life, the universe.
Yeah, I mean, it's understandable. I mean, there's so much going on and there's so much violence and people are suffering. There's been a lot of interreligious violent conflict, and it's understandable that people would wonder, you know, whether Christians and Muslims can get along. But the fact is that in most parts of the world they do get along, and in most parts of Africa, I found in my research, as I was just explaining, that Christians and Muslims do get along best where they're actually mixed together. where there's a great deal of diversity and integration. I think that we find trouble often where there's a great deal of religious segregation, where Christians are all living in one area and Muslims all in one area. And along that fault line, we often find trouble. And I think there are politicians who try to essentially use religious differences to serve their own purposes, and they play on people's fears. And sometimes, unfortunately, even religious leaders do that. And so that causes trouble. That causes trouble. And it's led to a lot of violent conflict in some parts of our world, including some parts of Africa.
Father, I guess the development of ghettos is not good in the sense that they become the ideal environment for radicalism.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that religious leaders have a really important role to play, including Catholic religious leaders. And we have some very wonderful Catholic religious leaders working together with Muslim religious leaders to cross that divide and bring people together and to promote interreligious understanding and mutual respect. A great friend of mine, Bishop Matthew Kuka in Nigeria, has really been at the forefront of that, along with Archbishop Kaigama in Jos, Nigeria. Other bishops, including Cardinal Onaikan, the Archbishop of Abuja, have also been very active in bringing Christians and Muslims together across the divide, trying to break down the barriers that prevent people from understanding one another and learning from one another and respecting one another.
Father, you just mentioned three really great Catholic personalities in the African scenario. But what about the Muslims?
Yeah.
I mean, can you mention really people of the same stature of influence and moral influence status in the Islam?
Yeah, I mean, one person in particular, the Sultan of Sokoto in northwestern Nigeria, has played a really important role. He's not the only one, but he's one very prominent Muslim religious leader who has really worked hard to promote interreligious dialogue. He's worked closely with Christian religious leaders, including Catholic religious leaders, who have a great deal of respect for the Sultan. And I know that the Sultan also has a great deal of respect for them. I think the real challenge is getting down to the grassroots level, because these are leaders at a relatively high level who certainly have connections to people at the grassroots level, but it's at the grassroots that we really need these efforts to become more effective and more more prevalent.
You're mentioning Sokoto, which is in the north of Nigeria, that also has been known for the area where Boko Haram has been more active. And we're talking here, you have Muslim personality that it's in favor of this dialogue. But what about these people? What about the ones that are really perpetrating all the violence and all these crimes? Do they listen to this particular sultan?
Yeah, no, they really don't. Boko Haram doesn't really listen. Maybe they pay attention, but they don't listen. They don't have a whole lot of respect, unfortunately, for the Sultan of Sokoto. It's hard to know what they really have respect for. They've been very active in the northeast of Nigeria. The Sultan is in the northwest, so it's in the northeast where Boko Haram has been most active and where they have mounted their deadly attacks on Christians and Muslims. Christians have suffered in a special way. Often when Christians are confronted by Boko Haram, especially if they're male, death often comes their way. People have fled, Nigerians have fled the northeast of Nigeria for safe places. Women have been captured, Christian women have been captured and essentially turned into sex slaves, many of them anyway. So Boko Haram, really, it's hard to know who they listen to or what they respect, and it's a very, very big problem. Christian and Muslim leaders, though, in the Northeast have been trying to work together. I think that so far, it seems that those efforts that have been most effective at sowing the seeds, I think, of mutual tolerance and those efforts that I think are going to be most effective at at diminishing the effectiveness of Boko Haram to recruit in northeastern Nigeria are interfaith efforts at the grassroots level. The government in Nigeria has really struggled to address the Boko Haram insurgency in an effective way. And you know, at least until recently, they really haven't been listening a whole lot to the religious leaders and the Christians and Muslims in the Northeast who have been most affected by the insurgency, who have suffered the most. I think in order for governmental efforts to be more effective at addressing the problem of Boko Haram, the government needs to listen to those most affected by the insurgency, and they need to inform their efforts based on the experiences of the people who have lived through really horrible events. And I don't think that they've done that enough to this point. Hopefully this new government in Nigeria will be better at listening to the people most affected by the insurgency in the Northeast.
So in your opinion, you think that it has to be a coalition between Christianity and Islam in order to face this enemy. You really think that this coalition could be effective and working?
I do. I think it's extremely important that we not let the Boko Haram insurgency, for example, prevent Christians and Muslims from coming together and working together. We really can't let an insurgency like that drive a wedge between Christians and Muslims. We can't afford to let that actually separate Christians and Muslims farther from each other. We really have to make sure that we bring Christians and Muslims together to address that problem and sow the seeds for mutual respect and respect for religious freedom in the future. I think it's crucially important. We just can't afford to let that insurgency, or say the al-Shabaab militancy in a country like Kenya, we can't afford to let that sour relations between Christians and Muslims. You know, the vast majority of Muslims in Nigeria want nothing to do with Boko Haram, and the vast majority of Muslims in Kenya want nothing to do with al-Shabaab. And so those are the people we need to be reaching out to, we as Christians, and working closely with to really pull the rug out from under extremist groups like al-Shabaab and Boko Haram.
Particularly because it's so painful, Father, like for instance, talking about Kenya, the massacre at the Garissa University. You know, when we read the reports that the attackers, the terrorists, were really selecting Christians, and if you couldn't say some of the paragraphs of the Quran, then you would be killed. When you see that the attack against Christians is so blatant and so direct, it is hard not to feel this animosity against Islam living in that society.
Yeah.
Or is my opinion very Western kind of point of view, Father?
No, I think you're right. I mean, I think that it does affect the way people start looking at one another.
Yeah.
It affects the way Christians begin to look at Muslims. They begin to look at Muslims with fear and suspicion. And perhaps then Muslims start looking at Christians with fear and suspicion because they're afraid that agents of the state you know, are going to come after them and essentially profile them, and they're fearful of those around them. So that's a big, big problem, and that's what we really need to try to overcome. We can't afford to let, as I was mentioning a few minutes ago, we really can't afford to let these events create a larger gap between us, a larger distance between us, because obviously that just spells more trouble into the future. And we're brothers and sisters to one another. We need to see that, and we need to do our best to make sure that a few people who are extremely violent and have done great damage, we can't afford to let a minority of Muslims like that sour Christian-Muslim relations more generally.
We don't want to get into politics because this is not a program for political commentary, but What do you think when there's some initiatives here in the U.S. about that, about emphasizing differences of religion, of groups, even to the point of segregation? Yeah,
I mean, from a Christian and more specifically a Catholic perspective, there's just no room for that. It's very, very disappointing when I hear the political discourse go in that direction. And I think, it's just a few people. I am heartened by the fact that in the United States, both Republicans and Democrats have come out against this idea of essentially banning Muslims wholesale from entering the United States. Catholics at one point in the United States were victims of this kind of discrimination. If you go back 100 years ago, or even less,
for Catholics, right?
Yeah, and so Catholics in particular should really be, how would you say, really should reject these kinds of calls and these kinds of statements. They really have no place from a Christian and more specifically a Catholic perspective. They're disappointing, they're divisive, and I think that they really aren't very helpful at all.
Father, there are some theories or ways that people try to understand or to explain why some of these radical groups have such a success. In your opinion, after the research that you've done on location in Africa, do you think that really poverty and illiteracy are really the main factors that harbor this kind of ideology?
I think those conditions certainly make it easier for extremists to recruit. When you have essentially idle young men, in particular, lots of idle young men, you have a pool of people who might easily be recruited by groups like Boko Haram and Al-Shabaab. I know that's a big problem in northeastern Kenya, where for a long time there's been a great deal of poverty and people have felt a bit marginalized. And the vast majority of people there are of Somali descent, if you will, and are Muslims. So I think that conditions of poverty and a lack of education certainly contribute to the rise of extremist groups like Al-Shabaab and Boko Haram. I'm not saying that it's the only, because we also find that there are lots of poor people out there who do not join extremist groups, right? So it begs the question, what is it that makes people, poor people in particular, susceptible to the calls of extremists? And so I think we have a lot to learn there, but I do think that if people are living at a decent standard and they have their basic needs being met, they have something meaningful in their life and there's a purpose to their life and they're basically have what they need to live, they're not going to join extremist groups and put their lives on the line and go out and kill other people and take their own lives in the process. I just think that obviously there are going to be some exceptions. There are exceptions, so I don't mean to say that it's an iron law as long as people have enough. We know that there are some people who are relatively wealthy and well educated who engage in extremist religious extremism. But I think that the foot soldiers are largely recruited from among poor people, people who have a lack of education and who suffer from poverty.
Do you think that there's also an element of coercion?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that many people feel like they have no choice.
If they don't join them, then they become victims.
Right. It's either join or
die,
be killed, right? Or people, many of them are captured and essentially pressed into service. Yeah, and if they don't cooperate, they're likely to be killed.
Now, Father, I want to turn the question around. What about these people that have been recruited in Europe, in the U.S.? Unfortunately, we've seen that some of the latest episodes in California, they are not poor, they are educated.
Exactly.
what is the allure for them to be involved in something like this?
Yeah.
Is there really a religious conviction?
I think that it's quite possible there's religious conviction there, but I also think that, one may not necessarily be poor in order to feel disenfranchised or marginalized. And so some of these people just simply might feel marginalized for whatever reason from mainstream society, and they have fallen victim to this extremist rhetoric that comes from ISIS and other extremist groups. So I think that, it's not necessarily material poverty, but the experience of marginalization. They're not necessarily the same thing. And I think that many people they're disenfranchised for whatever reason, and those are the people who are most susceptible to the calls of religious extremist groups. And I also think, you can't help but wonder also about people's own mental state that would make them so susceptible to extremist groups. So there may be something about that. I'm not saying that everyone who joins ISIS from the West has mental problems.
Probably not mental disabilities, but now that you mention that, Father, I think that fundamentalism of any kind or of any religion gives simple answers and very general answers, and somehow that gives a false sense of control and that you understand something.
Yeah.
Do you think that there is a little bit of this element that some of these Western people, they want order, simple, clear answers in a very convoluted world that we live in?
And Jonas, I think you're right. I do think that there are people looking for easy answers and simple answers to their own experiences, their experience of marginalization, and extremist groups provide that for people, right? You're suffering or you're feeling marginalized, or the world is not the way it should be because of the West, the Christians, or the West, right? And so we need to do something about that, and so they call people to essentially to join them in a war, right? A war against whether it's Christians or whether it's the West, to join them in a war. And that's, I think you're very right that there are people who are very vulnerable to these very simple answers to the problems that they experience.
Father, the second part of the title of your book, Lessons from Sub-Saharan Africa. What are the lessons? What have we learned?
Yeah, well, we have learned basically that religious diversity is not necessarily a bad thing for those who think that a political culture characterized by civic engagement and social tolerance is desirable, and that actually the lessons are that when Christians and Muslims are living together, and when they are integrated and have lots of interaction with each other, that actually the results are a more peaceful society and a society where there's greater religious tolerance, and where I think that political stability and democracy can thrive. In societies where Christians and Muslims are separated from each other, segregated from each other, we're likely to get trouble. And so I think the lessons are that religious diversity is not necessarily a bad thing for development, for peace, and for democracy. And it can actually be a very, very good thing for development, democracy, and peace.
Father, I think it is a privilege that we have the opportunity of talking with somebody so knowledgeable in terms of the political scenario and the international relationships, but you're a priest. So my last question to you is, how do you see this problem as an alter Christus, which that's what it is, a priest?
The problem of interreligious relations? Yeah, well, it pains me a great deal as a priest. I really believe that Jesus calls us to love one another and to respect one another. And I believe that Muslims are children of God as much as Christians are children of God. And I really believe, I have a great deal of respect for Islam. And I really believe as a priest that God is calling us to try to understand one another better and to try to work together to address the world's most pressing problems. This interreligious violent conflict is distracting us, taking way too much energy from us. We should be focusing on alleviating poverty together. We should be working on trying to promote efforts to fight climate change and respect the environment. These are big pressing problems, as Pope Francis has helped us to remember in Dowd C.S.C. And I really believe that Christians and Muslims have common ground there. We need to be working together. And so it pains me a great deal whenever and wherever I see Christians and Muslims spending lots of effort fighting one another, and instead of really focusing on those issues that are so important for our planet and for our world.
Father, thank you so much. Unfortunately, the time went so fast, but we can talk about this for days, I think. So I hope that we have pretty soon another opportunity to talk to you again.
Thank you, Jonas. I really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
And thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for being with us in another program of Where God Weeps. If you want to learn more about the situation of the church in Africa and also about these efforts for interreligious dialogue, we encourage you to contact the information at the end of this program. Thank you, and God bless.